Just because big tech is evil, it does not justify terrible policy. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin. As all of you will know, Facebook has taken the extraordinary step of blocking the sharing of all news content Australia-wide. This is in response to the Australian government introducing a new code that would compel major search engines, Google, and major social media companies, Facebook, to share their advertising revenue with major Australian media producers. This is because the Australian media landscape is shifting dramatically as a consequence of how people in Australia consume their media content. Originally, people had their websites set up. They would be browsing those websites directly, and the media companies would derive the advertising revenue from the amount of eyes that were on their website. With Google creating sort of Google News with lists and lists of media content, Google has its own advertising revenue. People will only click on the links that they're specifically interested in, and thus the vast majority of the advertising revenue will go to Google, and likewise Facebook. A lot of people just consume the media on the Facebook page, and the Facebook puts up their own ads and gains that revenue. So what the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, decided under Rod Sims was that the best thing would be for a bargaining code to be introduced that would compel these media giants, along with the search engines and social media conglomerates, to negotiate on a funding sharing arrangement, recognizing that there was a shared benefit between the two. The content creators, the media outlets, would produce the content and should get some of the advertising revenue that Google and Facebook were deriving. Google and Facebook, in their massive protest to this, steadfastly refused to participate. Google has taken a slightly different tack, which we'll get into, but Facebook said, look, if you introduce this code, we're going to block all media content because we are not going to pay for links, full stop. And that is a threat that they have made good on. So what is my view on this? Well, I feel incredibly dirty because I despise big tech. They're censorious. Their algorithms are creating all kinds of social tribal division. They think they're above governments and countries. We saw what happened with the 2020 US election, how Facebook and Twitter blocked Donald Trump. They blocked the sharing of media stories that weren't favorable to Joe Biden. Certainly blocking the New York Post, a 220 plus year old newspaper, which broke the exclusive stories about Hunter Biden on his laptop, the amount of money he was getting from Ukraine and China and Russia. All of that was blocked in the lead up to the election. And the way in which these censorious companies, blacklist people, cancel culture, they apply their trust and safety policies on an entirely partisan basis. So I have almost no regard whatsoever for these tech giants. However, unfortunately, in this case, they are correct. Rod Sims, the ACCC, who wrote and published this 600-page report, was totally wrong, I think, about the basis of this new bargaining code and the effect that that will have on the market. And to that end, there is a principle that everyone should take home, and that is that the patron god of good policy is pragmatism. And this bargaining code was never going to work, and its objectives were somewhat dubious to begin with. So Facebook and Google are separate in the way they approach it, and we should discuss them separately. Facebook, I sympathize with 100%. People willingly share their content through Facebook. People who are users of Facebook will post links. The media outlets themselves will post those links. Facebook is not a social media search engine. So why should they be paying for a service that they're not organizing themselves? This is something that is voluntarily put up. And the primary beneficiary of that service is the media outlets themselves, because they post those links, people go to their websites, and those media outlets will then put up subscription paywalls and other kinds of incentives on their own website to get consumers to pay money to that media outlet, with Facebook driving all of that traffic. Well, the blocking of the sharing of these social media accounts, it means that for the vast majority of media outlets who wouldn't have benefited from this code anyway because they don't qualify, only something like 0.1% of all media outlets in Australia would be covered by this code, well, they're being adversely affected as well. If it's a blanket ban on all media, then obviously the vast majority of independent news creators are going to suffer as well. And Facebook's reaction is entirely rational. The legislation that is being passed has a very broad definition of media. So Facebook is likely to not be able to differentiate between those that will be covered by the code and those that won't be. And thus, Facebook is doing what I would do in their situation. Say, well, okay, only a small percentage of Australians are sharing news content on their Facebook pages anyway. Of those that are, the majority are sharing news stories from around the world, not just Australian news. So it's going to impact the Australian consumer on Facebook very little. And yet they're asking us to share our advertising revenue with these media giants who are voluntarily posting these sites, these pages to Facebook. So it makes sense for us to block that service entirely so that we are not covered by this code. Perfect sense. And if I was a Facebook executive in Australia, I would have the same position. It's an entirely a market-driven logic. Google is slightly different because they do create compendiums of news content through their Google News page, and you are scrolling through different stories as it pertains to various media outlets, as you might have done previously on the website itself. And as you're scrolling through Google News, the advertising revenue is, of course, going to Google. So you could argue then that Google is benefiting from the rounding up of all of these news stories that are coming from other sources, and now perhaps they should enter into a funding sharing arrangement. Well, there is pros and cons to that. Google has realized that it's in its interest to get ahead of the curve and make their own side deals with these media outlets, but only certain outlets. So the sufferer of this code is the consumer. Because if you're in Australia, Google today, and you go and search the news, only certain news sources now come up. And that's because they've made a deal with Google, and Google is simply going to block all other news content because it's not going to show up in their algorithm. So instead of having many media outlets all competing based on the quality of their content and their ability to maximize their search engine optimization to improve their results in the algorithm, Google is picking winners because they've made a side financial arrangement with news outlets to post on Google. This is to the absolute detriment to competition. It's to the absolute detriment of the public, and an entirely foreseeable result of this new legislation the government seeks to introduce. The fact is that yes, search engines and Facebook and these social media giants get the majority of advertising revenue, but that is also growing the pie as people are sharing stories that they would never otherwise search for themselves, and are then clicking on those links and going to the various websites, and those websites then have an opportunity to convert that person into an ongoing paying subscriber. This is how these media giants succeed in this environment. You can't be King Canute and just yell at the sea and order it to go back into, like, that's just not the way it's going to work. And the Australian government has been incredibly short-sighted, frankly, in the way in which it has gone about this. There are so many areas of regulation with the social media tech giants that should be implemented. In the United States, most certainly the abolition of the 230C exemption that allows social media tech giants and Twitter and Facebook and Google even to act as publishers, but with the liability only of a platform, i.e. they can actually editorialize content without assuming any of the liability of what is published. That absolutely needs to be reformed as soon as possible. But this artificial advertising intervention to benefit very small numbers of media giants is absurd, is absolutely absurd. And as I said, only a tiny fraction of these giants, these media outlets are benefiting from the code, whereas 99% plus of media outlets are being adversely affected by the blocking by Facebook and the intervention, the algorithm by Google, but wouldn't have benefited from the bargaining code in any event. So there's picking winners in the market, there's a reduction of competition, there's a reduction of exposure and choice for the Australian consumer, and an entirely rational response from these social media giants and from Google, who are acting in the best interests of their shareholders and their company, and are frankly probably morally in the right as well. If I was Facebook, I would be very upset that the Australian government is trying to make me pay for things that other people are choosing to publish on our social media platform. And if I'm Google, I'm going to go, well, yeah, absolutely. Let's not get involved in this arrangement where we go to third-party arbitration and everything. Let's have our private side deals with specific media companies, publish all of their stories on our algorithm search engine, and just block everything else. I mean, it makes perfect sense. What other outcome was the Australian government expecting? It is so foreseeable, and there have been people, experts, who have warned of this. And I would point to the economist Joshua Gans, who has articulated perfectly what was going to happen. And I will leave a link to his latest thoughts in the description below. He's heavily involved in this entire process, and everything he said has come to pass. It has eliminated the choice for Australian consumers. It has not improved the revenue for media giants because they are losing all of their traffic. The social media companies themselves are the ones that are the primary supporters through exposing all of these media outlets to a wide audience, not the primary beneficiaries. And the service that they provide for their own advertising revenue doesn't depend on media. I mean, the outcome was already preordained. So I'm all for kicking the big tech companies in the teeth. Absolutely. But it has to be done for the right cause. It has to be done in the right way. And I think this is going to set us back. I did see a story that said that Canada and Western Europe, they're looking to copy what Australia is doing in the light of what Facebook has done. I don't believe it for a second. They're going to see Australians' case as a warning, how things can go wrong. They'll try and derive some lessons from it. It's possible that we will see more regulation of big tech in the future. I certainly hope so, but it needs to be done in the right way. And the best thing that'll come out of this Australian case is it'll be a warning to others as to how not to go about it. And as perverse and as sickening as it is for me to say, I think Facebook and Google are 100% right. They are doing what I would do in their shoes, and they're doing it for perfectly logical, foreseeable reasons. And the ACCC, Rod Sims, the Australian government, they just have no idea the way the system works. Reading the ACCC report, it was obvious that they had no concept of what was going to happen, even though that they were duly warned. So that's kind of my take on it, I guess. Do you disagree with me, though? Please let me know down below. what your thoughts on this whole issue is. Is it just sheerly inappropriate that Facebook just thumbs its nose to the Australian nation, irrespective of what the reason is? We all have to abide by the laws if we want to operate here. And Facebook has gone about this in an extremely churlish way. So people may dislike the way Facebook has behaved, but their ultimate position, I think, is correct. But I would love to be wrong about this, because there is a conflict within the soul that comes from agreeing with big tech. Thank you very much. Leave a like. Do subscribe. We talk about these subjects all the time. And I will see you next time. Thank you.